All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. All right. On to the great Democritus. The great Democritus. Perhaps the most famous or influential Pre-Socratic. Very interesting character. Well, I don't know much about his character. I don't think anyone does. But very interesting conclusions, I think would be more accurate of me. We have essentially the first atomist, that is, one who thinks that the physical universe is composed fundamentally of microscopic particles. Now, it's very possible that a certain Leucippus came up with this first. I don't exactly know those details. It is still debated. Democritus is widely attributed for popularizing this theory or refining it or expanding on it, etc. Now, this is quite brilliant. Okay? Just think about this. We've been talking about the role of empirical observation or just paying close attention to what you perceive and deriving conclusions. Because again, we do not have microscopes. We do not have other apparatuses that we take for granted in modern scientific technological advancement. This is around 2,500 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And yet here, he managed quite brilliantly to deduce or to conclude that the world, the universe at large, is fundamentally made of these tiny particles. Quite unbelievable. Imagine coming up with that. Really, again, do this exercise of scrapping all your education, your scientific understanding, physics, modern chemistry, all out the window. You have very early formations of theories that will go on to our modern understanding, our scientific understanding, but otherwise, this person managed to just, through sheer reasoning, figure out a conclusion that is, agreed upon and a necessary premise for so much of the physical sciences. It gets everything rolling. Quite amazing, quite impressive. Now, he argued that they are physically indivisible. In other words, they cannot be divided to any smaller particle other than itself, so that they are the smallest or they're the fundamental building block of matter. Of course, now we have a slightly more modified understanding of that. Let's just set that aside. Still quite a brilliant conclusion. So it's just fascinating. We have one of the earliest examples of what we would understand as a scientist, essentially. He's from the same era of these other pre-Socratic thinkers, and yet is going in a very different direction. So he has a few different related connected theories. One is this idea of the void, a kind of vacuum existence or vacuum state that I don't particularly want to go into. I don't think we need to worry too much about that. Now, his theory of knowing is very influential. We call this epistemology. A very important branch of philosophy is the understanding of knowledge. How do we know what we know? That's a huge one. So, and this one is particularly influential, I think, for the entire Western philosophical tradition, and especially for modern scientific breakthrough. Here's the thing. We have two kinds of knowledge Democritus is talking about. One is sensory perception. This is subjective. In other words, it's unique to everyone's individual experience, hence subjective. So right now where I'm at, it is winter. So it's cold based on my perception. And I'm moving right now. So I'm feeling the kinesthetic sensation of movement. I am hearing certain things. Right now I am closing a door. So there's a sound coming from that movement. I'm feeling the grains of the wood as I move the door. If I have a drink, I will notice if it's cold or warm or hot. I will notice the flavor, etc. The thing is, again, according what Democritus is stressing is, yeah, but in reality, we have the void, or we have empty space and atoms. Okay? That's the actual reality. The subjective impressions we have are resulting from the influence of the atoms bombarding our senses at all times, 24 hours. Right? And he's not denying, he's not saying that our perceptions are somehow illusory or, unreal, and there are philosophers that go that far, okay? But he is simply saying that we cannot derive some actual foundation of truth, capital T truth, objective truth, if there is such a thing. We cannot derive a true, there's that word again, reliable foundation of knowledge this way. It is through the intellect, it is through the mind, through reasoning, that we get nesi, genuine knowledge. Genuine knowledge. So you can see how this ties directly to his theory. Nowhere in my visual perception have I ever seen an atom. I don't have an electron microscope, okay? And so I cannot see, submicroscopic levels. Democritus obviously derived this theory not through sensory perception, but through sheer intellect, through the capacity of rationality and reasoning. So, because our tastes will differ from person to person, our smells, what we hear, what we touch, the normal sensory experience varies so radically. You can think about the small ways in which this is true, and the more major ways this is true. Opinions are very subjective. Some people enjoy, I enjoy cacophonous, loud, chaotic music sometimes. Other people think it's just trash and noise. Some people love hot weather. Some people always want to be in a cold climate. On and on and on and on. All these things related to our preferences, which are a lot of them based on our, psychological conditioning in relation to our immediate sensory perception. So it's pretty interesting. These other pre-Socratics we've been talking about are really trying to do a fine-tuning of empirical observation via the senses as an understanding of reality. He's taking a step back and looking at how faulty sensory perception is, and that intellectual deduction via reasoning, or perhaps logos, this will be a very important concept we'll unpack more, is the way to truth about the matter. And that's the thing. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter what language you speak, your opinions, your preferences, your favorite food. All of us have the same exact capacity for reasoning. Therefore, we are all, equal candidates towards the truth if we can rely on this capacity for reasoning. Very, very, very influential. This twofold knowledge I'm talking about. It might not seem a big deal to you, but this was huge in terms of what goes on to be modern foundations of science. Also a mathematician, also interested in what we might think of biology or understanding living beings, understanding ecologies, understanding cosmology, where how the universe was created. Pretty fascinating. Very, very systematic, considered the prototype of what we understand as a modern scientist. Very interesting person. Again, all from sheer deductive power of logic, the power of reasoning. He comes up with this notion that the universe is composed inherently of atoms. Fascinating. Okay, so lots going on with this cat. Now, not to say, as far as I know, Plato was not really a fan of Democritus. And I'm not trying to say who influenced who, but the important stress on what reasoning is capable of, being the rational animal, quote unquote, and the senses or appearances deceiving us or deluding us, is going to be enormous with major thinkers such as Parmenides and Plato, who will be very, very luminous figures in this history. Of course, the idea that our senses deceive us and perhaps might be telling us a complete illusion is going to be a very major idea in older forms of what we now call Hinduism, but there was no such concept at the time. Very early Indian philosophical speculation. The idea of Maya, the idea which is expanded upon in many different sub-traditions throughout South Asia, of how we are in some kind of, hologram or some kind of projection or some kind of dance of the gods, so to speak, that there are veils that keep us in illusion. And this is largely because of our senses, because our senses are limited and we're not seeing the actual reality. We're seeing the appearance, the glimmer, not the actual reality. So this twofold distinction will become more and more important in many traditions. You have the Gnostics, for instance, talking about the demiurge is also deceiving us with this completely illusory reality that's not really going on, and time isn't necessarily going on. I won't get into the details there. They come later on. Interesting syncretic or blend of different Mediterranean, Egyptian, Greek, Judaic, esoteric systems flowing together. So there you go, atoms and the void, atoms and empty space. Notice he's not getting at all, into the more metaphysical or the mystical or the theological. The idea of a divine reality or a higher reality. This is why he's very much the prototype of a scientist, is because he's just kind of focusing on the data at hand, so to speak. What is immediately apprehensible? How do we understand what's apprehensible? again, perhaps we don't understand what's apprehensible. Is there some capacity of the mind deeper down that can pierce to the actual reality that is composed of these fundamental particles that are not even visible at all? So just imagine how deeply abstract and strange that probably would have seemed, especially those who are deeply invested in mythology, in more theological understandings, or the four elements understandings, so important for the Pre-Socratics. Inherently, reality is inherently composed of water or fire, etc. This is getting on a whole other fine-tuned level of analysis of, what makes up the four elements. So the other Pre-Socratics will give an argument that it's irreducible. In other words, that the further you go down, you will just find some inherent, uba water or underlying substratum of one of these elements. And Democritus is saying, no, if you go further down, you're going to find that even those great elements are composed of these fundamental atoms. I'm just saying, somewhat speculatively, I don't think he even talked much about the four elemental theory. He was kind of going his own way to understand nature. So very original, very iconoclastic thinker. I remember, just as a little anecdote here, I went on this really interesting, it was a conference, but it went on for a few days and it was a bit experimental out in a forest in rural Oregon with a bunch of philosophers and writers. It was an environmental conference. It was about ecological environmental ethics. And there was a philosopher there who had traveled pretty far from the Midwest to come here. And sometimes we'd sit around campfires and shoot the breeze and share stories and whatever. He'd written a poem about beating up Democritus, which is pretty hilarious, and perhaps that might make sense as we unpack the many different kinds of ideas in this history. He was being a little joking and tongue-in-cheek, but really not joking also, because what we might call scientism, or the domination of science being the and only way to understand our world, our mind, our consciousness, everything, nature, the universe, even the topics religion covers, that science can explain it all, that science is the way to understand. In a way, you could trace it to Democritus as being that's essentially what this person who recited this poem was trying to get at. That if he had taken him out, perhaps we would have had a different kind of scientific understanding in which we didn't have, plastic or technologies that were so polluting and harmful. In other words, the kind of overly expansive scientific technological dominance that is starting to perhaps have serious problems ecologically in terms of social, global, political connectivity, and pushing philosophy out of its prominence as a form of understanding, as a love of wisdom. That so this poem was saying, joking about taking Democritus out of the picture as a way of raising up the old love of wisdom as an actual reputable way of understanding, a way of knowledge. At any rate, it's an interesting way to approach old Democritus. So your thoughts? Is science where it's at? Well, it is in many ways. Let's complicate this though. What do you think about atomic theory? What do you think about it being, discovered so early without any of the modern scientific technological equipment we take for granted? or any of the theories and hypotheses for that matter, to just very basic formations of what becomes, fairly sophisticated entire disciplines of knowledge. And has science overstepped its boundaries as a source of knowledge? That's a huge question that we'll talk about throughout this series.